The honourable member for St. John's South Mount Pearl.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I stand in support of today's motion, as tabled by the honourable member for Toronto Danforth, that immediate steps should be taken towards abolishing the Senate. One of the debates in this country involving the Senate, a debate that I followed as a young journalist covering former Newfoundland and Labrador Premier Clyde Wells in the 1990s, was the debate over whether the upper chamber should be reformed into a triple E model: elected, equal, effective, a triple E Senate. Today, there's no debate, Mr. Speaker. The upper chamber has become a triple U Senate. Triple U as in unaccountable, triple U as in unelected, triple U as in unapologetic.
Shame. Abolish it, Mr. Speaker. Abolish it. There is no alternative. The Senate has gone too far, is too far gone to save. It has become a gated country club, a political pasture. It has become a golden handshake for friends of the Conservative and Liberal parties, for fundraisers, for partisans, and for failed politicians. The senators do the bidding of the parties they represent. They are unelected. They are unaccountable to the people. They are unapologetic for the embarrassment that they have become. Yes, Mr. Speaker, the Senate is an embarrassment to Canadians from one end of this country to the other end of this country, an embarrassment to Canadian politicians, real Canadian politicians, like elected members of Parliament who stand before you today. I have no excuses for the Mike Duffys of this country, Mr. Speaker, for the Mike Duffys of this country who take months to figure out exactly where they live. What a joke. What an embarrassment. To quote Michael Bliss, a professor and historian at the University of Toronto, quote, "This is a classic case of Canadians discovering that senators have no clothes. They turn themselves into our daily comic relief segment of politics." Again, I was a journalist in my previous life, Mr. Speaker. I have no defense for Mike Duffy. I have no defense for Pamela Wallin. She's supposed to represent Saskatchewan, but her primary residence is in Toronto, and she holds an Ontario health insurance card. I find personally the Duffy and Wallin cases particularly appalling. Journalists should know better when we spend our working lives holding politicians to account. It is bred into us. We know instinctively where the line is. Where the line is, that must not be crossed, and it has most definitely been crossed. Then there's Senator Patrick Brazeau. If it wasn't bad enough that he's facing allegations of abuse of his housing allowance, there have also been sexual assault complaints lodged against him. The embarrassment has become constant, Mr. Speaker. The embarrassment is daily. The scandal over senatorial housing allowances has led the Senate to seek legal advice that says as long as senators sign a declaration of qualification form that says they reside where they reside, that it's okay. The honourable member for Timmins James Bay stood in this House yesterday and he equated that declaration to a pinky swear, Mr. Speaker, a pinky swear. In my home province of Newfoundland and Labrador, there's Senator Fabian Manning, Mr. Speaker. He was a member of Parliament. He lost his seat. He was appointed to the Senate. And then he was cherry-picked for the 2011 federal election to run again for the Conservatives in the federal riding of Avalon. Manning lost again. Then he was appointed to the Senate again. So we have a senator who was rejected by the people, not once, Mr. Speaker. He was rejected twice, speaking on behalf of the Conservative government all over my riding of St. John's South Mount Pearl. Is Senator Manning supposed to be Newfoundland and Labrador's voice? Because he's not, Mr. Speaker. We're supposed to represent Newfoundland and Labrador in Ottawa. We're not supposed to represent Ottawa, be representatives of Ottawa in Newfoundland and Labrador. That doesn't work, Mr. Speaker. That's not the way that it's supposed to work. Senators are held to one level of account. Canadians are held to another level of account. EI claimants, for example, Mr. Speaker, they have investigators knocking down their doors while senators hide behind their doors, if you can find their doors, Mr. Speaker. The budget of the Canadian Senate is $92.5 million a year, Mr. Speaker. Most Canadians can't even fathom that much money. So let me bring this home, Mr. Speaker. Senator Wallin's $350,000 in travel expenses would cover old age security for 57 seniors a year. Mike Duffy is eligible to collect another $1.3 million in salary before his mandatory retirement at the age of 75. Patrick Brazeau will bring in another $7 million in salary before he turns 75. These are basically jobs for life, Mr. Speaker. Jobs for life. Well, I'm sorry, Mr. Speaker, not really jobs for life, salaries for life. The average number of days of work days in 2011 and 2012 for a Canadian senator was 56 days. 56 days, Mr. Speaker, and an annual salary, you've heard this said before, of $132,000 a year, plus living expenses, for a job, for a salary that they'll continue to receive until they're 75. You don't have to run for election. You're not accountable to anyone. You don't have to apologize to anyone when you fleece the taxpayer. So yes, Mr. Speaker, the Senate absolutely should be abolished. Senators vote according to the interests of the parties they represent. I mentioned that earlier, rather than the regions they're supposed to represent. Mr. Speaker, the Senate was created as a chamber of sober second thought. It was created to offset the representation by population in the House of Commons. Again, it was envisioned that senators would vote according to the region they represent, to offset representation by population. Small provinces like Newfoundland and Labrador, Mr. Speaker, have 7 seats in the Commons. Small provinces like Prince Edward Island have 5 seats in the House of Commons. Altogether, the Atlantic provinces have 32 seats. Then you have provinces like Quebec that have 75 seats, and Ontario that have 106 seats. The bigger provinces, with the larger populations, have more seats, obviously, in the House of Commons, and those totals are destined to increase. The number of seats in the House of Commons will rise by 30 in the 2015 general election. Quebec, Ontario, BC, Alberta will all see their number of seats increase. Meantime, provinces like Newfoundland and Labrador, provinces like the 3 that make up the maritime provinces, won't see any increase. Our representation will be watered down. The point that I'm getting to, Mr. Speaker, is that while I agree with the abolition of the Senate, 100% take it out, there's a bigger debate taking shape in this country, Mr. Speaker, over the need for democratic reform. Let me cut to the chase. How do smaller provinces like Newfoundland and Labrador, with a population of 514,000 people, half the population of Ottawa, how do we ensure that we have an equal seat at the Confederation table with larger provinces like Ontario and Quebec that have more representation because they have larger populations? How do we ensure that the interests of Newfoundland and Labrador are heard and acted upon? This week in my province, Mr. Speaker, we have news that 3 more groundfish plants will be shut down, throwing 300 rural Newfoundlanders out of work. More than 20 years after the Northern Cod moratorium, and there's still no recovery plan in place. Ottawa's handling of the fisheries has been a disgrace and an affront to Newfoundlanders and Labradorians. Again, how do we ensure that smaller provinces have an equal seat at the Confederation table? From Newfoundland and Labrador's perspective, from the perspective of smaller provinces across the country, that's the debate that must happen, Mr. Speaker. That's a debate that's destined to happen, Mr. Speaker. Yes, the Senate absolutely must be abolished, but the question must also be asked, how do we offset representation by population so that smaller provinces have an equal footing for the good of our culture, Mr. Speaker, for the good of our identity, for the good of future generations, so that smaller provinces like Newfoundland and Labrador aren't made to feel like lesser provinces, Mr. Speaker. So yes, Mr. Speaker, abolish the Senate and the abomination it has become. But then let's get to the real work, Mr. Speaker, the real work of democratic reform. Thank you.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for South Shore St. Margaret's.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I listened somewhat to the speech and the mistakes in it, and I'd like to thank him now for the extra seat in Prince Edward Island. Hopefully it'll be a Conservative seat. But maybe should check a little better on who's doing the research. But, Mr. Speaker, here's my question. Now, I've listened to NDP speaker after NDP speaker after NDP speaker get up and talk about that nasty unelected Senate. How people run for office and they happen to lose, and then they get appointed to Senate, and that is the sin of all sins, Mr. Speaker. That is the evil of all evils. But here's the party that wants proportional representation in this place. So if you run for Parliament and you get defeated, but your party has 30% of the votes, you get 5 more members and you're appointed to the House of Commons instead of elected. What a bunch of hypocrites. Good Lord.
The honourable member for St. John South Mount Pearl.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable.
The honourable member for St. John South Mount Pearl.
Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for the question, and I'd also ask the honourable member to please listen to my answer. I know that he said at the beginning of his question that the Conservatives listen, quote, somewhat. And that's the problem with Conservatives, is the fact that they listen somewhat. They don't listen like they should to everything that's being said. Now, Mr. Speaker, I didn't hear a question from the honourable member, so I have nothing to respond to. But I will say, again, abolish, because he was only, again, listening somewhat, so I'll repeat it again. So, first things first, abolish the Senate, and then democratic reform. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Winnipeg North.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, the member makes a very strong statement: abolish the Senate and then look at democratic reform. The member that spoke before him stated that we're going to consult with provinces before we do anything. It seems to me that the NDP have adopted the position. The position is that we are going to abolish. Why would you declare publicly that you are going to abolish the Senate and then go out and listen to what the premiers have to say? It seems to me that there's a gap between reality here. You cannot abolish the Senate and then go out and consult with the provinces is what you want to do with the Senate. You need to consult with the provinces. You have to get all of the provinces on side, in which you are not going to do, Mr. Speaker, but that's technically what you would have to do. You would have to get all of them on side in order to be able to abolish the Senate. On the other hand, he wants to ensure that the regions have representation here in Ottawa. For many regions of the country, including Manitoba, Atlantic Canada, and the Prairies, they look at the Senate as a reformed body that could provide that guarantee of regional representation if, in fact, we come to a day in which we can have constitutional debates inside our country. Today is not the day. Today is about the economy.
Order. The honourable member for St. John South Mount Pearl.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for the question. I thank the honourable member for the question, but I have to say, Mr. Speaker, I also find it hard to take the honourable member seriously when he stands up and he asks a question about the Senate. Because every time he stands on his feet and asks a question about the Senate, I just see it as the honourable member defending the old boys club of the Senate, the Liberal appointees in the Senate. So every time he speaks up, I don't see just the honourable member speaking. I see him speaking on behalf of this old boys network. It's old parties, Conservative parties, and Liberal parties protecting their friends. That's what I see. So I find it hard to take any question you ask seriously. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.